He gave a lost little girl his coat and bought her a hot chocolate. He never imagined that the next day 2 silent men in a black sedan would arrive to escort him to a world he didn't know existed. A world where a single act of kindness carried the weight of a blood oath. The silence of the Galleria after closing was a universe of its own. It was a hollow, echoing space where the ghosts of 1,000 conversations lingered in the stale air, mingling with the scent of popcorn and industrial disinfectant. For Arthur, this was home. His cart, with its squeaking wheel and sloshing bucket of grey water, was his only companion. He was a man made of shadows, a janitor in his late 60s whose life had been worn down to a simple, lonely rhythm. Mop, wipe, repeat. He was invisible, and most days he preferred it that way. The world was a loud, sharp-edged place, and his quiet corner of it, scrubbing scuff marks from the polished floors, was a small, predictable sanctuary. Tonight, however, the silence was different. It was broken. A sound, small and fragile, cut through the hum of the ventilation system, a whimper. Arthur stopped his cart, the squeaky wheel falling quiet. He listened, his brow furrowed. It came again from the direction of the shuttered food court. He pushed his cart forward, his worn rubber-soled shoes making no sound. Tucked into the alcove of a closed pizzeria, a little girl sat huddled on the cold tile floor. She couldn't have been more than 7, her face streaked with tears, her pink coat doing little to ward off the deep, commercial chill. Her sobs were quiet, exhausted, as if she'd been crying for a very long time. Arthur's heart, a muscle he hadn't felt ache in years, gave a painful throb. He'd seen plenty of things left behind in the mall. Forgotten shopping bags, half-eaten pretzels, a single glove, but never a child. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Hey there, little one," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. "It's okay," he said softly. "I work here. Are you lost?" She gave a tiny, jerky nod, a fresh tear tracing a clean path down her dusty cheek. He looked around the empty food court, then toward the cavernous, dark hallways. The security office was on the other side of the mall, a long walk for a scared child. He knelt, his old knees protesting. "What's your name?" She whispered a name he barely caught. Sophia. He didn't have much. His pockets contained a worn leather wallet with $3, a ring of keys, and a lint-covered cough drop. But he had his coat, an old, thick wool jacket that had seen him through 20 winters. He shrugged it off and draped it over her small, trembling shoulders. It swallowed her whole, smelling faintly of sawdust and distant rain. "There," he said. "That's a bit warmer." He remembered the vending machine near the service entrance. "How about some hot chocolate while we figure this out?" Her eyes, wide and brown, finally met his. They held a universe of fear, but now a tiny spark of trust, too. He helped her up, her small hand fitting into his calloused one, and together they walked through the sleeping mall, a forgotten old man and a lost little girl, 2 invisible souls who had found each other in the echoing dark. He didn't call security right away. He just sat with her, watching her sip the lukewarm cocoa, making sure she knew, for a few minutes at least, that she wasn't alone. The next morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through his tiny apartment. It was a sound that didn't belong here, in a building of peeling paint and quiet desperation. He froze, his hand hovering over his bowl of oatmeal. Landlord? Police? He wasn't sure which was worse. He shuffled to the door, peering through the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway. They were large, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that seemed to absorb the dim light. They weren't police. They weren't landlords. They were something else entirely. They just stood there, patient, silent, waiting. What would you do? Comment below. Would you open that door? Fear, cold and immediate, seized Arthur. His world was small and contained. Unexpected knocks at the door were harbingers of trouble. Eviction notices, utility shut-offs, the final, weary surrender. These men, with their broad shoulders and watchful stillness, represented a level of trouble he couldn't even comprehend. He thought of ignoring them, of pretending he wasn't home, but their presence felt absolute, as if they knew not only that he was there, but what he was thinking. He took a shallow breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to let the moment pass. But then the image of the little girl, Sophia, flashed in his mind, her tear-streaked face, her tiny hand in his. Had he done something wrong? Had her parents misunderstood his intentions? The thought that his simple act of kindness could be twisted into something sinister was more terrifying than the men themselves. He had to know. He unlatched the deadbolt, the click sounding like a gunshot in the morning quiet. The door swung inward on a complaining hinge. The men didn't move. They simply looked at him. The one on the left was older, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience, his graying hair cropped short. The one on the right was younger, his expression unreadable, his eyes missing nothing. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them frowned. Their faces were masks of professional neutrality. The older man spoke, his voice low and steady, a gravelly sound that held no malice, but carried undeniable weight. Arthur Romano? It wasn't a question so much as a confirmation. Arthur could only nod, his throat too dry for words. "We've been asked to bring you with us," the man continued. "Mr. Moretti would like to speak with you." The name meant nothing to Arthur. He scanned their faces, searching for a clue, a hint of their purpose. He found nothing. There were no threats in their tone, no weapons visible, yet the air crackled with an unspoken authority. It was a request, but it felt like a command. I have to get to work," he stammered, the excuse sounding feeble even to his own ears. The man's gaze was unwavering. "Your shift has been covered. Please, it will not take long." There was no room for argument. It was as if all the decisions had already been made, far away from this dingy hallway, and he was simply the final piece to be moved into place. He looked back at his small, bare apartment. The worn armchair, the stack of library books, the half-eaten bowl of oatmeal on the table. It was his whole life, humble and insignificant. And now these two men were here to take him from it, to lead him somewhere unknown. His fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was joined by a profound sense of bewilderment. He had spent a lifetime being overlooked, fading into the background. To be singled out, to be sought with such deliberate purpose, was a sensation so foreign, it felt like stepping off a cliff. He grabbed his thin jacket from the hook by the door, a flimsy thing compared to the wool coat he had given away. He closed the door behind him, the lock clicking shut on the only world he knew. As they led him down the stairs and into the waiting silence of the morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Who was Mr. Moretti? And what could he possibly want with a forgotten old janitor? The car was a black Lincoln, the kind Arthur had only seen in movies. The leather seats were cool and smooth, smelling of polish and money. He slid into the back, the door closing with a heavy, satisfying thud that sealed him inside. The two men took their places in the front, the younger one driving, the older one in the passenger seat. They didn't speak. The engine started with a low, powerful hum, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving Arthur's dilapidated apartment building behind. The silence inside the vehicle was thick, broken only by the soft click of the turn signal and the whisper of the tires on the asphalt. Arthur stared out the window, watching his neighborhood slide by, the bodegas with their hand-painted signs, the laundromats steaming up the morning air, the familiar faces of people on their way to jobs that paid too little. It was a world of struggle, but it was his world. His mind raced, a frantic search for an explanation. He replayed every moment with the little girl. Had he said something wrong? Did she tell her parents a confusing version of the story? Maybe they thought he was a kidnapper. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He was a nobody. He had no resources, no one to call. If these men accused him of something, who would believe his side of the story? Who would even listen? He clutched the worn fabric of his trousers, his knuckles white. The city changed around them. The gritty, industrial landscape of his neighborhood gave way to tree-lined streets and manicured lawns. The houses grew larger, set further back from the road, old brick and stone fortresses hiding behind wrought iron fences. It was a part of the city he knew existed but had never seen up close, a world as foreign to him as a distant country. He risked a glance at the men in the front. The driver's eyes were fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. The older man in the passenger seat was looking straight ahead, but Arthur had the unnerving feeling that he was being watched in the rear-view mirror. The man's stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat. It spoke of a deep, unshakable confidence, the kind a man has when he knows he is in complete control of a situation. Arthur felt a fresh wave of despair. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, being moved across a board he couldn't even see. He thought about speaking, about asking where they were going, but the words wouldn't form. What could he say? His voice would only betray the terror that was strangling him. He was utterly powerless, adrift in a silent, speeding vessel, being carried toward an unknown fate. The car slowed, turning onto a private drive marked by two massive stone pillars. A gate, ornate and imposing, swung open for them without a sound, as if by magic. They proceeded up a long, winding driveway, past ancient oak trees that cast deep shadows on the perfectly kept grounds. At the end of the drive stood a mansion. It wasn't a modern glass box, but an old, sprawling stone house that looked like it had been there for a century, radiating a quiet, formidable power. It was the kind of house that had secrets embedded in its very walls. The car came to a stop before the grand entrance. The engine cut, and for a moment, the world was utterly still. The driver's door opened. The journey was over, but the true, terrifying mystery was only just beginning. What waited for him inside those heavy oak doors? The younger man opened Arthur's door, holding it for him with a gesture that was surprisingly respectful. Arthur stepped out onto the bluestone driveway, his gaze traveling up the imposing facade of the mansion. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and leaded glass windows glinted in the morning light. It was less a home and more a monument, a testament to a kind of wealth and influence that was so far beyond his comprehension, it felt unreal. He followed the older man toward the front entrance, his footsteps feeling clumsy and loud on the stones. The heavy oak doors swung open before they reached them, revealing a man in a simple black suit, his face impassive. He nodded at Arthur's escorts, then at Arthur himself. "This way, please," he said, his voice quiet and formal. Arthur stepped inside and his breath caught in his throat. The foyer was vast, with a soaring ceiling from which hung a crystal chandelier that shimmered like a captured star. A grand staircase with a dark, polished wood banister curved upward into the shadows of the second floor. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and something else. A faint, pleasant aroma he couldn't place, perhaps flowers from the immense vase that sat on a console table against one wall. Everything was immaculate, a world away from the dust and grime he spent his nights scrubbing. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had stepped through a portal into another life. He was acutely aware of his own shabby appearance, his worn jacket, his faded work pants, the scuffs on his shoes. He felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. He was led through the foyer and into a large, book-lined study. A fire crackled in a cavernous stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light on the rich, dark wood paneling and rows upon rows of leather-bound books. Seated in a high-backed leather armchair near the fire was a man. He appeared to be in his 70s, with a full head of silver hair and a face that was deeply lined, not with worry, but with a kind of serene authority. He was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. As Arthur entered, the man placed a book he was reading face down on a small table beside him and slowly rose to his feet. He was not a large man, but his presence filled the room. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were sharp and intelligent, and they fixed on Arthur with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply curious. Behind the man, standing near the window, was the little girl, Sophia. She was no longer crying. Dressed in a clean white dress, she looked small and safe in the grand room. The moment she saw Arthur, her expression changed. A flicker of recognition, of relief, crossed her face. She took a hesitant step forward. The man in the sweater turned his head slightly toward her and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the encouragement she needed. She ran across the thick Persian rug, her little shoes making no sound, and wrapped her arms around Arthur's legs, hugging him tightly. Arthur froze, stunned. He looked down at the top of her dark head, then up at the man watching them, his heart a confusing mix of relief and terror. The man smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his severe features. "Arthur Romano," he said, his voice a deep, calm baritone. "I am Antonio Moretti, Sophia's grandfather. Thank you for coming. We have a great deal to discuss." Arthur stood frozen, the small girl clinging to his leg, her warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear that still gripped him. He could only stare at Antonio Moretti, the man whose name had been a mystery just minutes before. The name still meant nothing in a public sense, but in the context of this house, this car, these silent men, it carried an immense, unspoken weight. Moretti gestured toward a plush armchair opposite his own. "Please, sit," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Enzo, bring us some coffee." The younger man who had driven the car nodded silently and slipped out of the room. The older man remained standing, a silent guardian near the doorway. Arthur, feeling awkward and out of place, gently patted Sophia's head. "It's okay now," he whispered to her. She looked up at him, her large dark eyes filled with a child's simple gratitude. She let go and scampered back to her grandfather's side, watching Arthur with a shy curiosity. He lowered himself into the armchair, sinking into the soft leather. It felt like being swallowed by a cloud. He had never sat in something so comfortable in his entire life. He placed his calloused hands on his knees, unsure of what to do with them. He felt like an actor who had stumbled onto the wrong stage in the middle of a play he hadn't rehearsed for. Moretti sat back down, his gaze never leaving Arthur's face. He didn't seem angry or accusatory. Instead, his expression was one of profound, sober gratitude. "My son and his wife, they were at a dinner across town," he began, his voice low and measured. "Sophia was with her nanny at the cinema in the Galleria. The girl, she is young." She turned her back for a moment, and Sophia, who is very curious, wandered off. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "For 2 hours, we did not know where she was. 2 hours." He let the words hang in the air, allowing Arthur to feel the weight of a parent's worst nightmare. "The police were called. My people were searching. The entire mall was on lockdown. It was chaos." Arthur swallowed hard, his own fear from the morning paling in comparison to what this family must have endured. Enzo returned with a silver tray bearing 2 delicate porcelain cups of coffee and a small pitcher of cream. He placed it on the table between them and retreated to his post by the door. Moretti continued, and then a security guard found her, not alone, not crying in a corner. He found her in the janitor's break room, sitting on a stool, wrapped in a man's wool coat, sipping hot chocolate from a paper cup. He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes boring into Arthur's. He said she wasn't scared anymore. He said she told him a nice man had found her and was keeping her safe until her mommy and daddy came. Moretti picked up his coffee cup, his movements slow and deliberate. "I would like to hear it from you, Mr. Romano. Tell me what happened, from the moment you found her. Every detail." It wasn't an interrogation, it was a request for a story this powerful man needed to hear for himself. Arthur looked from Moretti to Sophia, who was now quietly drawing in a book at a small desk in the corner. His fear began to recede, replaced by a simple, human connection. He was no longer just a janitor in a powerful man's study. He was the man who had found this man's granddaughter. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room, and began to speak. Arthur started his story hesitantly, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. He described the echoing silence of the mall, the squeak of his cart's wheel, the faint sound of a child's whimper that had broken the monotony of his night. He told Moretti how he found Sophia huddled in the pizzeria's alcove, her small body trembling with cold and fear. As he spoke, he forgot about the grand study, the silent men, the imposing presence of his host. He was back in the cold, empty food court, kneeling on the hard tile, his old joints complaining. He described the look in her eyes, the raw terror of a child who believes she has been completely and utterly abandoned. He explained his decision not to drag her on a long walk to the security office, choosing instead to offer a moment of simple comfort first. "She was so cold," Arthur said, his voice gaining a little strength as the memory became more vivid. "My jacket. It was old but warm. I couldn't stand to see her shaking like that." He recounted how he'd put it over her shoulders and how it had seemed to calm her instantly, a small island of warmth in a vast, scary place. He told Moretti about the vending machine, how the hot chocolate had cost him $1.50, nearly half the cash he had on him. He didn't say it to brag or to imply sacrifice. It was just a fact, a detail in the story. He described how they sat together in the small, stark break room under the buzzing fluorescent light, and how he'd just let her sip the drink in silence until she was ready to talk, to tell him her name. Moretti listened without interruption. His gaze was intense, his face unreadable, but he absorbed every word. He seemed particularly interested in the small things, the way Arthur had spoken to her, the fact he'd thought of hot chocolate, the simple, paternal gesture of the coat. These were not the actions of a man following a protocol. They were the instincts of a decent, kind-hearted human being. Arthur explained how, only after Sophia had finished her drink and seemed calm, he had used the service phone to call the main security desk, telling them he had found a lost child and would wait with her in the break room. He finished his story, his voice trailing off. "And then the guard came," he concluded lamely. And that was it. He finally looked up, meeting Moretti's eyes, expecting, he wasn't sure what, judgment, dismissal. Instead, he saw a look of profound, almost sorrowful respect. Moretti was silent for a long moment, swirling the coffee in his cup. "You did not treat her like a lost item, Mr. Romano," he said, finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You treated her like a person. You gave her your warmth. You gave her your attention. You gave her your dignity." He set the cup down, the porcelain making a soft clink against the saucer. "In my world, there are currencies far more valuable than money. Loyalty, honor, respect." He leaned forward again, his expression serious. "And there are debts. A man who harms my family incurs a debt he will spend his life repaying. But a man who shows my family kindness, especially my Sophia," he paused, his gaze unwavering, "that creates a debt of a different kind, a debt of gratitude. And the Moretti family always pays its debts." The word debt hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. Arthur had lived his life indebted to landlords, to banks, to the relentless march of bills that always arrived on time. He understood the crushing weight of that kind of debt. But this was different. The way Moretti said it, it sounded less like a transaction and more like a law of nature, an unbreakable code. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in the plush chair. "Sir, you don't owe me anything," he said, his voice earnest. "Anyone would have done the same. I did what was right." Moretti smiled, a faint, knowing curve of his lips. "That is where you are wrong, Mr. Romano. Not everyone would have done the same. Many would have called security and walked away. Many would have been annoyed by the inconvenience. Some, I shudder to think, might have seen an opportunity. His eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. You saw a child, and you acted with compassion, without a thought for yourself. That is rare, and it does not go unnoticed. He stood up and walked over to his desk, a massive piece of dark carved wood. He picked up a single manila folder and returned to his seat. He didn't open it. He simply placed it on the table between them. "My people are thorough," Moretti said, his voice returning to its calm, measured tone. "When my granddaughter was found safe with you, I needed to know who you were." The statement sent a fresh chill down Arthur's spine. The idea of being investigated, of his small, simple life being picked apart by these efficient, silent men, was deeply unsettling. "They discovered a few things," Moretti continued, tapping a finger on the folder. "They learned you have worked at the Galleria for 22 years, that you have never been late, never missed a shift you weren't scheduled to miss. They learned your wife passed away 8 years ago." Arthur flinched at the mention of his late wife, a wound that had never truly healed. "They learned you live in the apartment on North Mill Street, and they learned that this morning a final eviction notice was scheduled to be posted on your door." Arthur stared at the folder, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and shock. He was going to be homeless, that knock on the door. He had assumed the worst, but the reality was even more bleak. He had been so focused on the immediate, strange threat of Moretti's men that he had forgotten the mundane, existential threat that was about to upend his life. He felt exposed, his private struggle laid bare in this opulent room. He started, but no words came. What could he say? "It was all true. This debt I speak of," Moretti said, pushing the folder slightly toward him. "It is not a gift. It is a rebalancing of the scales. You protected what is most precious to me. It is only right that I protect what is yours." His gaze was direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You will not be losing your home, Arthur. The building's owner has been persuaded to forgive your arrears. In fact, your rent has been taken care of for the foreseeable future. Consider it a retainer." Arthur looked at him, bewildered. "A retainer? For what?" Moretti leaned back in his chair. "For being a good man," he said simply. "My family values good men in our community. You are now under my family's care. Nothing and no one will trouble you again." The ride back to his apartment was as silent as the one that had brought him to the mansion. But the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it had been thick with threat and uncertainty. Now it was filled with a dizzying, unbelievable sense of reprieve. Arthur stared out the window, but he didn't see the streets or the buildings. He saw the word eviction in his mind, the stark, red letters on the notice he had been dreading for weeks. And then he heard Moretti's voice, calm and certain. "You will not be losing your home." It couldn't be real. Men like Antonio Moretti did not exist in his world. Kindness on that scale was something you read about in fairy tales, not something that happened to janitors in rundown city neighborhoods. The black Lincoln pulled up to his curb. The younger man, Enzo, got out and opened the door for him. Arthur climbed out, his legs feeling unsteady. He expected them to just drive away, but Enzo walked with him to the entrance of his building. He didn't say a word, just watched as Arthur fumbled with his keys. Arthur managed to get the main door open and turned back. "Thank you," he mumbled, not sure what else to say. Enzo gave a slight formal nod. "Mr. Moretti will be in touch," he said, and with that, he turned and walked back to the car. Arthur watched it pull away, a sleek black shark disappearing back into an ocean he didn't belong in. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. He reached his door and stopped. The spot where the eviction notice should have been posted was bare. There was no tape residue, no sign it had ever been there. His heart hammered. He unlocked his door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The bowl of oatmeal, the worn armchair. But the air felt different. The oppressive weight of dread that had been his constant companion for months was gone. He walked over to his small kitchen table, where a stack of mail sat. On top was a new envelope, thick and white, with no stamp or return address. It had simply been placed there. His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a rent receipt from his landlord, a notoriously difficult man named Mr. Henderson. It showed a balance of 0. Below that, it was marked "Paid in full for the next 12 months." A full year. He sank into a kitchen chair, the paper shaking in his hand. It was real. This wasn't a dream. Antonio Moretti had reached into his life and, with a single, invisible gesture, had erased his single greatest source of misery. The relief was so immense it was painful. It felt like a dam breaking inside him, and for the first time since his wife died, Arthur put his head in his hands and wept. Not from sadness, but from a profound, shattering sense of disbelief and gratitude. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, a new feeling began to creep in. A cold, quiet whisper of unease. Nothing in his life had ever come for free. A year's rent, a retainer. You are now under my family's care. What did that mean? What would be expected of him in return? The world of Antonio Moretti was governed by debts and codes he didn't understand. He had been pulled from the brink of disaster, but he felt a creeping suspicion that he had just been placed at the edge of something far more complex and perhaps far more dangerous. He was safe, but was he free? The next few days were surreal. Arthur went back to work at the Galleria, pushing his cart through the familiar, echoing halls, but nothing felt the same. He felt like he was walking through a dream of his own life. He was the same man, in the same uniform, scrubbing the same floors. Yet he felt fundamentally changed. The invisibility he had once found comforting now felt like a costume he was wearing. He half expected one of Moretti's men to appear from around a corner, to deliver a message or a summons, but there was nothing. The silence from that other world was absolute. He started noticing small, almost imperceptible shifts in his own neighborhood. When he went to Mr. Chen's grocery for his weekly supplies, the old man, usually gruff and businesslike, greeted him with a warm smile. "Arthur, the best tomatoes for you today. Just came in," he said, placing 3 plump, perfect tomatoes in his bag without weighing them. At the corner bakery, Mrs. Gotti, a woman who rarely spoke, handed him his loaf of bread and added a small bag of biscotti. "For your coffee," she said, her eyes holding a new, knowing look. He tried to pay for them, but she just waved his hand away. "Is nothing," she insisted. The biggest change was his landlord, Mr. Henderson. Arthur ran into him in the hallway one afternoon. Normally, Henderson would either scowl and mutter about the rent or ignore him completely. This time, he stopped, a nervous, almost deferential smile on his face. "Arthur, everything all right with the apartment? The faucet, is it still dripping? I can have someone up to look at it this afternoon." Arthur, stunned, could only stammer that it was fine. He had been complaining about that drip for 6 months. As Henderson hurried away, Arthur realized what was happening. They knew. Somehow the word had spread through the invisible channels of the community. They didn't know the details, but they knew he was connected to someone important. They knew he was protected. The feeling was deeply unsettling. For his entire life, he had been anonymous. Now he was someone to be acknowledged, to be treated with a cautious respect. It was comforting in a way. The constant, low-level anxiety of being a vulnerable old man had vanished. But it was also suffocating. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, the pressure of an unspoken obligation. He was living in a cage with invisible bars, gilded with the kindness of strangers. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had just helped a little girl. He started to wonder if this was the price of Moretti's gratitude, to be forever marked, to be part of a system he hadn't chosen. The quiet heroism of his single act of compassion had rippled outward, and he was now caught in its currents, being pulled further and further from the simple, lonely shore he had always known. What would happen If those currents turned dangerous, what would this protection require of him if the peace of the neighborhood was ever truly threatened? The peace of the neighborhood, it turned out, was more fragile than he knew. For years, the area had been insulated from the worst of the city's troubles. There was an unspoken understanding. You didn't cause problems on Moretti's turf. But a new element had begun to creep in from the south side, a young, reckless street gang calling themselves the Vipers. They were arrogant, disorganized, and didn't respect the old boundaries. They started small, with graffiti on the brick walls of the bakery, then escalating to shaking down delivery drivers for a street tax. The older residents watched with a quiet, simmering anger, their fear palpable. This was a violation. Arthur saw it firsthand one evening. He was on his way home from the grocery, his small bag of provisions in hand, when he saw two of the Vipers, kids really, no older than 19, draped in cheap jewelry and misplaced confidence, cornering Mr. Chen outside his store. They were blocking his path, one of them leaning against the doorframe, the other looming over the small, elderly shopkeeper. Their voices were low and menacing, but Arthur could hear the words clearly. "Just a little insurance, old man," one of them sneered. "To make sure nothing bad happens to this nice little shop of yours." Mr. Chen stood his ground, his face pale but resolute, his hands clutching the handle of his broom like a weapon. "I have nothing for you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Arthur's heart pounded. His first instinct was to walk away, to turn the corner and pretend he hadn't seen anything. This was not his fight. He was an old man, a janitor. What could he do? Getting involved would be foolish, dangerous. He thought of Moretti's promise. Nothing and no one will trouble you again. But this wasn't about him. This was about Mr. Chen, the man who had given him the best tomatoes just days before. This was about the fabric of the neighborhood, the unspoken pact of mutual respect that these young thugs were tearing apart. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a hot, protective anger. The protection he was under felt like a sham if it only applied to him and not to the decent people around him. He stood there for a long moment, hidden in the shadows of the neighboring building, a war raging within him. To intervene was to risk everything. To do nothing was to betray the very compassion that had brought him to Moretti's attention in the first place. He saw the fear in Mr. Chen's eyes, and it mirrored the fear he saw in Sophia's just a few weeks ago. It was the fear of the vulnerable cornered by a world that was too big and too cruel. He looked at the two young men, at their smug, cruel faces, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. But what could he possibly do? He was not a man of action or violence. He was a man of mops and buckets. Yet, he now possessed a different kind of currency, a connection to a power he was only just beginning to understand. Could he use it? And what would it cost him if he did? Arthur didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of Mr. Chen's frightened face burned into his memory. Moretti's protection felt like a heavy coat on a summer day, burdensome and out of place if he couldn't use it to shelter anyone but himself. The next morning, he walked with a purpose he hadn't felt before. He knew what he had to do, but he had no idea how to do it. He couldn't just call the mansion. He didn't have a number. He couldn't go to the police. That felt like a betrayal of the unwritten rules he was now a part of. He had to trust the system that had enveloped him. He remembered Enzo's parting words. "Mr. Moretti will be in touch," but there had been nothing. Perhaps the system worked both ways. Perhaps it required a signal. As he left for his shift at the mall, a black Lincoln was parked across the street from his building. It was the same model as the one that had picked him up, its windows darkly tinted. It wasn't there by coincidence. It was watching, waiting. This was his chance. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street. As he approached, the passenger side window glided down silently. The older man, the one with the face like a road map, was sitting inside. He didn't look surprised to see Arthur. "Mr. Romano," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a simple greeting, but it held a question. Arthur's hands were sweating. He felt like a child tattling to a teacher, but the memory of Mr. Chen's fear spurred him on. There's something you should know, he began, his voice shaky. There are some young men. They call themselves the Vipers. He described what he had seen, the extortion, the fear in Mr. Chen's eyes. He was careful with his words. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't demanding action or calling for violence. He was simply reporting, bearing witness, as one concerned member of a community to another. Mr. Chen is a good man, Arthur finished quietly. He doesn't deserve to be afraid to stand outside his own store. The man in the car listened, his expression unchanging. He just watched Arthur's face, his gaze analytical, as if he were assessing not just the information, but the man delivering it. When Arthur was done, the man was silent for a moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Arthur," he said. The use of his first name was significant. It was a subtle shift, an acknowledgement. "We take care of our own. Go to work. Don't worry about this anymore." The window slid up as silently as it had descended. The car remained parked. Arthur stood on the sidewalk for a moment, then turned and walked toward the bus stop, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had done it. He had stepped off the sidelines. He had invoked the power that had been granted to him, not for himself, but for his neighbor. Now he could only wait and see what seeds he had sown and what kind of harvest they would yield. The next day, the neighborhood was different. It was quieter. The tension that had been building for weeks, that low-grade hum of fear, had vanished. Arthur walked to Mr. Chen's grocery in the late afternoon, his stomach in knots. He wasn't sure what he would find. When he turned the corner, he saw the store was open, the pyramids of fresh fruit gleaming in the window. Mr. Chen was outside, sweeping the sidewalk, just as he did every day. But his posture was different. The stoop in his shoulders was gone. He looked relaxed, at peace. As Arthur approached, Mr. Chen looked up and saw him. A slow, wide smile spread across his face. He said nothing about the Vipers. He didn't have to. He simply leaned his broom against the wall, walked back into his store, and came out with a small, perfect watermelon. He pressed it into Arthur's hands. "For you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no translation. "A gift." Arthur looked into the old man's eyes and saw a profound, silent understanding. There were no questions asked, no explanations offered. The problem had been taken care of. That was all that mattered. Later, he heard whispers at the bakery, two men talking in low tones over their espressos. The Vipers were gone, not arrested, not hospitalized, just gone. One of their mothers had apparently received a large, anonymous cash deposit into her bank account with a one-way bus ticket for her son to a city 1,000 miles away. The other had supposedly been reminded of an elderly grandmother in the old country who suddenly and desperately needed his help. There was no violence, no mess, just a quiet, efficient, and irreversible removal. It was like a surgeon excising a tumor. The community was healthy again. Arthur finally understood the nature of Moretti's power. It wasn't the brutish force of street thugs, it was something far more sophisticated. It was the power of influence, of knowing who people were, what they cared about, what levers to pull to make things happen quietly. It was the power to solve problems, not just create them. And he understood Omerta, the code of silence. No one would ever speak of this. Mr. Chen would never thank him directly for his role. Mrs. Gotti would never mention the gang's disappearance. It would simply be a shared, unspoken truth, a quiet reaffirmation of the neighborhood's invisible shield. He had not just been protected, he had become a part of the protection. By speaking up for someone else, he had solidified his place in this strange, hidden world. He was no longer just a beneficiary of its rules, he was a guardian of them. His one small act of compassion in the mall had not just changed his own life, it had rippled out, restoring the peace for an entire community. Months passed. Autumn bled into a cold, bleak winter. Arthur's life settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet dignity. The fear of eviction was a distant memory. He was no longer invisible. He was Arthur, the man who was looked after, the man who, in his own small way, looked after others. He greeted his neighbors by name, and they greeted him back with genuine warmth. He was a part of something, a thread in the rich tapestry of the community, and it was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. He still pushed his mop at the Galleria, but the work no longer felt like a mark of his failure. It was just a job. His real worth, he was beginning to understand, lay elsewhere. One snowy afternoon in December, there was another knock on his door. His heart no longer leapt with fear. He opened it to find Enzo, the young silent driver. He was holding a large flat box tied with a red ribbon. "From Mr. Moretti," Enzo said, his expression as neutral as ever. "He requests your presence for dinner this evening, 7 o'clock. He handed Arthur the box and turned to leave. "Wait," Arthur called out. "What is this?" Enzo paused. "Something to wear?" he said, before descending the stairs. Inside the box, nestled in tissue paper, was a beautiful dark grey wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a simple, elegant silk tie. It was finer than anything Arthur had ever owned, even in his youth. He touched the fabric, marveling at its quality. This was not a summons, it was an invitation. He felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. He spent the afternoon getting ready, showering carefully, shaving with a new razor blade. As he put on the suit, he looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror on his bedroom door. The man looking back at him was different. He was still old, still weathered by a hard life, but he stood straighter. The suit didn't make him a new man, but it seemed to reveal a part of him that had long been hidden. At precisely 6:30, the black Lincoln was waiting for him. The ride to the mansion was familiar now, the transition from his gritty neighborhood to the opulent one less jarring. When he arrived, the house was ablaze with warm light, a beacon against the falling snow. He was shown not to the study this time, but to a grand dining room. A long table was set for a dozen people, gleaming with polished silver and crystal. Antonio Moretti was standing at the head of the table, not in a sweater, but in a tailored suit that matched Arthur's. He smiled warmly when Arthur entered. "Arthur, welcome to my home." But it was not Moretti's smile that made Arthur's breath catch. It was the small figure who broke away from the group and ran toward him, her face alight with joy. "You came!" Sophia cried, throwing her arms around his waist. He looked down at her, and then at her grandfather, and a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging washed over him. He was no longer an outsider. The dinner was a revelation. Arthur was seated at the table, not as a guest or an employee, but as a friend. He sat next to Moretti's son, Sophia's father, a serious man with his father's intelligent eyes, who shook his hand firmly and thanked him with a sincerity that needed few words. He met Sophia's mother, who touched his arm and told him, "You have a place in this family forever." The table was filled with Moretti's children and their spouses, a close-knit, boisterous family that laughed, argued about politics, and passed platters of pasta with practiced ease. They weren't monsters or caricatures from a movie. They were people bound together by love and a fierce, unshakable loyalty. Arthur mostly listened, sipping a red wine that was smoother than anything he had ever tasted. He heard them talk about business, shipping logistics, real estate investments, the importation of olive oil. It was the legitimate face of the Moretti family, the engine that funded their lives and their influence. But underneath it all, he could feel the presence of that other world, the world of codes and debts. It was in the way they fell silent when an outsider, a server, entered the room. It was in the way Moretti would make a quiet comment, and everyone would listen with rapt attention. He was the undisputed patriarch, the center of their universe. After the main course, as dessert was being served, Moretti tapped his glass with a spoon for attention. The lively conversation died down instantly. He looked down the table, his gaze finally resting on Arthur. "We have a guest of honor tonight," he said, his voice filling the room. "A man who reminded us of something important." He looked around at his family. "We live in a complicated world. It is easy to become focused on strength, on strategy, on protecting what is ours. We can forget that the foundation of our family, the reason our name has honor, is not built on fear. It is built on respect." He turned his eyes back to Arthur. "This man, Arthur Romano, found my Sophia when she was lost and afraid. He had nothing. He expected nothing. He acted not from obligation, but from the decency of his heart. He gave her his coat. He gave her his last few dollars for a hot chocolate. He protected her." Moretti paused, his voice growing softer, more personal, and in doing so, he protected us. He protected the heart of this family. He raised his glass. "In our world, loyalty is everything. An act of kindness to one of us is an act of kindness to all of us. Arthur, you are no longer a stranger. You are not just a friend. You are family. You have a place at this table, always." A chorus of "To Arthur" echoed around the room as everyone raised their glasses. Arthur felt a blush creep up his neck, a feeling of warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. He looked at Sophia, who was beaming at him from across the table. He looked at the faces of this powerful, complex family and saw not menace, but acceptance. He had spent his life feeling like a ghost, a forgotten man on the margins. But by performing one small, simple act of kindness for a lost child, he had found something he never knew he was looking for: a home. He had been escorted into a mansion, not as a prisoner, but as a long-lost relative, finally welcomed into the fold. His poverty had been replaced not with riches, but with something far more valuable: belonging. Kindness is a language everyone understands, yet we so often forget its power. A small gesture can change a day, or in Arthur's case, a life. Have you ever been on the receiving end of an unexpected act of kindness that changed everything for you? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of compassion to build the strongest families, subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. You never know when a simple act of goodness will rewrite your world.